On November 9th, 2019, at approximately 15:19 hours, I responded to an address in reference to a reported suspicious male subject walking throughout the parking lot of the business. Dispatch later received information from callers that the male subject had been observed bleeding heavily from a wound to his neck. Officer W was the first to arrive on scene and make contact with this subject, who he reported as being severely injured from what appeared to be a single long cut to the subject's throat. EMS was called to the scene, and the subject, then identified as a Mr. C, was transported to a local area trauma center for emergency treatment. No information had been obtained at that point from the victim as to who had assaulted him or why. I had arrived on the scene just prior to the victim boarding the ambulance. Officer W reported that the victim had been in possession of a pit bull dog on a leash, and that the victim had reported to Officer W that his girlfriend could take the dog. Two subjects were located nearby in the immediate area that were identified as being familiar with the victim. These subjects were later identified as a Mr. H and a Miss J. Other officers had arrived on the scene, including Officers B, A, and Lieutenant B, to assist once Officer W had called for fill-in units to respond to emergency traffic due to the unknown nature of the victim's injuries. I made contact with Miss J, who was nearest to the ambulance. Miss J reported to EMTs that she was the victim's girlfriend and that she hadn't directly observed what had occurred, but that the victim had informed her that he'd been attacked at a nearby homeless camp. My partner and I have responded to this camp several times in the past and have made contact with several subjects who will later be identified as being involved in this report. I asked Miss J if she knew who had assaulted the victim, and she responded that she had heard from the victim that a subject only known as Mr. A had been at fault. The victim described Mr. A as a white male with long dark hair, wearing jeans and layered t-shirts. Miss J reported that Mr. H had been with her when the victim had been assaulted. I immediately approached Mr. H, who was standing in front of the business, holding the victim's dog by its leash. I have known Mr. H to frequent the homeless camp in question, located behind where this assault was later found to have occurred within. I asked Mr. H what had happened, and he reported that he and Miss J had walked from the camp to the grocery store nearby to purchase beer. Mr. H was carrying a case of Natural Light brand beer. Mr. H reported that the victim must have been assaulted just after he and Miss J had walked away from the camp, because they'd seen him at the camp just prior to finding him with police in the parking lot, bleeding profusely from his neck. Mr. H reported that he didn't know who had hurt the victim, but that his best guess was a subject that he'd only known as Mr. A, who Mr. H reported as having a personal beef with the victim related to Mr. A, currently dating an ex-girlfriend of the victim's. I confirmed with Mr. H that they had been at the homeless camp behind, and he responded in the affirmative. I informed Lieutenant B that my partner and I would be going to investigate the potential crime scene at the homeless camp, due to us being very familiar with the layout of the camp, including having extensive historical contact with the primary resident and controller of the camp, a Mr. G. My partner and I left the business lot to seek out information at the camp, which is accessible to business parking lots by means of a cut-through within a densely wooded area separating the two adjoining properties. Once on scene at the camp, my partner and I approached on foot with weapons drawn, as a precaution in the event that a suspect was still on scene wielding a bladed weapon. Upon our approach into the mouth of the camp, my partner and I observed a fire burning within the center of the camp, which is common during the winter months here, and voices could be heard emanating from within the heart of the camp further. The leader of the camp heard us approaching and welcomed us into the camp. Once we had determined that the camp was free of any aggressors, we holstered our weapons and began conversing with all of the subjects within. 3 subjects were seated around the fire, who I knew to be Mr. G, a Mr. R, and a Mr. M. These 3 subjects are all regular persons contacted at this camp, and have all been receptive to my partner and I in past dealings with them. In speaking with the subjects within the camp, the leader of the camp asked me to walk outside with him so that he could give me the entire story related to the victim's assault. I left my partner inside the camp to speak to the other 2 subjects. The leader of the camp and I walked outside of the camp into the main lot behind, and he reported that he had been the subject responsible for the victim's injuries, who he only knew as. When asked further, the camp leader reported the series of events leading up to the victim's injury as follows. The camp leader reported that several subjects had been seated around the fire within the camp when the victim had approached the camp along with Miss J. The camp leader reported that the victim and his girlfriend, Miss J, will often come to the camp to share beer and other goods with the group collectively as a means to better serve the whole group, but that lately there had been a personal controversy between the victim, Miss J, and another male-female pair of subjects who the camp leader identified only as a Mr. A and Miss B. The camp leader reported that the victim used to date Miss B, and that since the termination of their intimate relationship, which had ended in bad favor with the entire group, that Miss B's new boyfriend, Mr. A, had become very protective of Miss B, causing controversy between Mr. A and the victim. The camp leader reported that he had attempted several times to keep the 2 pairs of lovers separate from each other while they were visiting the camp due to their contemptuous relationship, but that his attempts at cooling heads were not always successful, leading to at least one instance where Mr. A and the victim had gotten physically violent with each other. The camp leader reported that earlier on the report date that he and several subjects had been sitting around the fire when the victim and Miss J had arrived, stirring conflict between the 4 individuals listed above. The camp leader reported that when he felt tensions beginning in the crowd, that he had advised Mr. H to ask Miss J to accompany him to the nearby grocery store to buy beer for the group to calm everyone's demeanor and remove Miss J from the group, who had been the newest frequenter of the campsite and who had demonstrated on every occasion where she had been in the presence of Mr. A or Miss B open contempt for the pair due to their treatment of the victim. The camp leader reported that once Mr. H and Miss J had left the scene on foot to procure beer, that tension had stirred more fervently between Mr. A and the victim, and that the victim had picked up a freshly cut section of timber that he had begun swinging at members of the crowd in a violent and threatening manner. The camp leader identified the piece of wood that was lying in the center of the lot that I was speaking to him within. The piece of wood was later found to be approximately 25.5 inches in length and 1.5 inches in diameter, with a pointed branch offshoot protruding from the tip of one end of the wood. The camp leader reported that the victim had been swinging this piece of wood at members within the camp, and that the victim had actually struck Mr. A and the camp leader himself in their heads. The camp leader reported that when the victim came back for a second assault upon the camp leader, that he produced a folding blade knife from his pocket, opening the blade upon the same, showing the blade to the victim, and warning the victim that he would not hesitate to defend himself if the victim tried to swing it at him again. The camp leader reported that when the victim disregarded this defensive threat and swung at him again, that the camp leader stood his ground and ran his pocket knife over the victim's neck. The camp leader reported that the victim had run off towards the nearby business lot after the altercation had concluded via the cut-through in the wooded area between these lots. The camp leader reported that he could observe blood spraying from the victim's hands, which he'd placed over the area of his neck where the camp leader had run the blade of his knife. The camp leader reported that he had the knife in his pocket now, which he hadn't touched since the incident. and asked if I wanted to confiscate it. I retrieved the knife and placed the same within a plastic evidence bag while wearing nitrile gloves. The knife blade had what appeared to be fresh, wet blood upon the same. The camp leader reported that he was defending himself and that he'd come to the police department to give a full statement on his involvement to clear everything up. I called for the crime lab and a lab technician arrived on scene shortly afterward. I informed the camp leader to remain nearby and that I'd wait for lab to arrive to photograph him on the scene. The camp leader agreed and remained on scene while I attempted to retrace the steps that the camp leader had reported the victim had taken after being cut. Of note, the camp leader appeared to be withholding information or providing me with a rehearsed series of events related to the victim's injuries occurring, which I found to be out of character for the camp leader, who is normally open and forthcoming with my partner and I regarding any information asked. I meticulously traced back the pathway that the victim had reportedly taken from the parking lot where I'd been speaking to the camp leader and the location where the victim had been located by Officer W in front of the business. While walking this path, I found a green sedan parked at the entrance of the cut-through between the lots on the business side, and the dog that the victim had been walking on a leash was now within this same vehicle. Miss J and Mr. H had been sitting near the vehicle, seemingly waiting for us to conclude speaking with the camp leader so that they could re-enter the camp. I continued walking the path described by the camp leader and found no traces of blood upon the lot pavement, except for 3 small droplets of blood that were central to where the victim had been located and stopped by Officer W prior to being loaded into the ambulance. I walked back to the lot where I'd left the camp leader, and I observed the crime lab arriving. Once the lab technician had arrived on the scene, I walked her through the scene and informed her of our need to photograph the camp leader and the piece of wood. This was completed, and the lab technician and I retraced the steps I'd taken within the lots to attempt to locate any further evidence of the assault. No such evidence, save the 3 droplets of fresh blood, were discovered. We returned to the parking lot where I'd left the camp leader, and the lab technician requested that I escort her to the emergency room to speak with the victim personally. I conferred with my partner regarding my involvement, and he reported that he would remain on the scene to attempt to collect any further information or evidence. I left the scene and met with the lab technician at the emergency room located at where we made contact with the victim within emergency room number 9. A nurse was on scene with the victim who reported that the victim had bled severely and that she believed a major artery in his neck could be compromised. The nurse reported that she was waiting to hear back from a physician on site to determine the scope of the victim's injuries and outlook. I spoke then personally to the victim on scene and provided him no information that I'd obtained from the homeless camp. The victim, when asked about what had occurred, reported that he had come to the camp with Miss J to commune with the camp leader and the campmates, which he and Miss J did often. The victim reported that shortly after he had sat down within the camp, Mr. H and Miss J left the camp to retrieve beer from the local grocery store, and that a Mr. A subject entered the camp, apparently angry at the victim's presence. The victim reported that he used to date Mr. A's current girlfriend, who he then identified as Miss B. The victim reported that due to his previous dating relationship with Miss B ending poorly, that Mr. A and the victim had been openly controversial to each other and had engaged in fist-fighting previously on 2 separate occasions. The victim reported that as Mr. A entered the camp, he began openly threatening the victim and telling him to get out of the camp. The victim reported that he stood up to leave once he realized that the camp leader and the other men on scene were not going to vouch for him remaining, and that as he stood up, Mr. A drew his fists up towards the victim in what the victim described as a boxing stance. The victim reported that due to Mr. A being positioned at the only entrance or exit into the camp, that the victim had no way of leaving and did not involve him coming close in proximity to Mr. A, and that he felt cornered and threatened by Mr. A's posturing and presence. The victim reported that he attempted to walk out of the camp when Mr. A suddenly lunged at him, knocking the victim to the ground in the process. The victim reported that he got to his feet and struggled to run out of the camp when he realized that he was pouring blood from an apparent open wound in his neck. The victim reported that he placed his hands over where he believed the blood was pouring from and realized that he was losing a massive amount of blood very quickly and panicked. The victim reported that he began struggling to walk through the lot with his dog towards where Miss J's vehicle was parked at the other end of the cut-through, and then he felt that Mr. A was still coming after him. The victim reported that he began losing more blood and became lightheaded, ultimately resulting in him drawing the attention of several bystanders within the business parking lot, and finally Officer W, who instructed the victim to remain in place until EMS could arrive to help him. The victim reported that he had no doubt in his mind that when Mr. A had knocked him to the ground, that Mr. A had been concealing a knife within one of his hands, slicing the victim's neck in the process. The lab technician on scene photographed the victim's injuries and left shortly afterward. I made contact with my partner via telephone and Lieutenant T, who were on scene back with the camp leader at the campsite, and informed them of the information that the victim had provided me. I remained on scene with the victim while a surgeon operated on his neck to obtain more information related to the victim's injury. The surgeon reported as he cleaned and sutured the victim's injury that the wound had most definitely been caused by a bladed weapon, and that the injury had cut through all of the dermal layers of the victim's neck, and that the injury had been consistent with a single motion. The injury was more narrow towards the victim's spine and progressively widened in diameter as the injury continued towards the victim's throat, opening at its widest point at the left side of the victim's throat beneath his chin. The surgeon further opened the victim's injury manually, showing all of the affected layers of tissue. The surgeon reported that it was his opinion that if the injury had been less than 1 millimeter deeper into the victim's tissue, that the victim's carotid artery would have been structurally compromised beyond repair, and that the victim would have likely succumbed to this type of injury on scene prior to EMS ever having the opportunity to respond and save his life. I left the emergency room after the surgeon had completed closing the victim's wound and returned to the campsite, where I met with my partner, Officer W, and Lieutenant T, along with a K-9 officer who had responded also. I was informed that officers on scene had made contact with Mr. A, who had returned to the camp after I'd left. Officers reported that this subject's full name was, and that he and Miss B had been in contact with the camp leader and officers. I was informed that the camp leader had an outstanding warrant that required his arrest also. I observed Mr. A approaching our location, and I took custody of him as my partner took custody of the camp leader. While searching Mr. A on scene prior to placing him within my patrol vehicle, 2 pocket knives were located within his pockets that were transferred immediately into a pair of unused nitrile gloves and placed within my coat pocket. While en route to the police department, Mr. A, within my patrol vehicle, made several statements to the effect that he had assaulted the victim and that he was happy that he'd hurt him. This entire transit was recorded via my internal in-car camera system and was stopped once we arrived at the police department. Further information related to Mr. A's admissions of involvement will be detailed within a supplement report to this report, to be concluded on a subsequent date. We transported the camp leader and Mr. A to the police department, and I processed Mr. A while the crime lab photographed relevant areas of Mr. A. Once Mr. A had been processed, I proceeded to escort him to the interview room, where I began a formal interview process. My partner accompanied I and Mr. A, while the camp leader remained within a holding cell guarded by Officer B. A formal interview took place with Mr. A, wherein he denied his being associated with injuring the victim. A more detailed account of this interview will be submitted within a supplemental report to this report, to be completed on a subsequent date. This interview was recorded via the system at the police department. Mr. A was later placed back within a holding cell while we transported the camp leader to the interview room and proceeded to conduct a formal interview of the camp leader related to his involvement, wherein the camp leader denied his involvement in the victim's injuries, suggesting then that he had lied to me on scene when first being questioned because he was covering for Mr. A, who he had believed was wanted in reference to an outstanding warrant. And that if he had been aware of the victim's injuries being so severe at the time I first questioned him on scene, that he never would have taken the blame. The camp leader reported that he wasn't sure exactly how the victim was injured, but that Mr. A and the victim had been involved in a mutual affray type situation, while both were armed with pieces of loose wood nearby. A more detailed account of this interview will also be submitted within a supplemental report to this report, to be concluded at a later date. This interview was also recorded via the system within the police department's interview room. The camp leader and Mr. A were transported to the county building, where the camp leader was confined beneath a preset bond for his outstanding warrant, and Mr. A was confined beneath a $30,000 secured bond with a court date of. DNA was collected from Mr. A on scene, and he was formally charged with attempted murder. The victim in this case made a full recovery, but was made unavailable for trial proceedings due to him moving states before the trial could begin. Several other members of the homeless camp would later come forth to investigators and swear under oath that the victim was actually the primary aggressor in this event, and the other camp members were merely acting in self-defense.